Welcome, I'm Tina Chansey and this is Dave McGowan, and we're here to talk about how to practice. But before we talk about how to practice, we have to talk about what to practice. And it's not just somebody saying to you, well, you got to practice this or else it won't sound good. You really have to figure out what's going on in the piece so you know what musical things you want to do with it. And then you'll know what to practice because maybe you can't do them. So, the favorite way that I've got of sharing a language for what goes on in a piece is something I've talked about a little called Schmerg. And Schmerg is the brainchild of Jan Leroux, who was my professor at New York University. And his idea was that you talk about the melody, the harmony, and the rhythm. What goes on in those? And then the S at the beginning of Schmerg stands for how does it start? And the G at the end of Schmerg stands for how does it grow? How does it change? And those different ideas all together give you more of a sense of what really goes on in a piece. And of course, each person can interpret that differently, which gives you a big variety of ways that a piece could be. But in this case, we thought that we would take the Handel Sonata in C major, since it's a piece that everybody knows, and talk a little about the first movement and the fifth movement. And David and I have had a little bit of dialogue on the principles of Schmerg, and then he's been applying them to how he sees the piece. So what do you think in that first movement?
Well, the first movement's kind of interesting because if you're looking at like melodic elements, it doesn't have like a really connected melodic. It's kind of a combination of strong rhythmic elements as well as melodic. Mm-hmm. And so as far as looking at what is actually dominant, you have, for instance, in later on, measure 5 or 6, you have a very, very strong dotted rhythm, which kind of defines a lot of the energy.
Right, but it doesn't start that way, does it?
It doesn't start. It starts. I'm talking about the middle of these, but no, it starts with this basically an arpeggio up to from middle range C to a high C. Yeah. And then descending back down into a D cadence, but
I know.
And then it repeats itself.
Which is really interesting, man. How many pieces do you know that exactly repeat themselves?
Well, not terribly many.
Not so many,
yes.
yeah.
And of course it begs the question as far as what do you do? Do you play it the same way or you play it differently?
Yeah, it's one of those decisions you got to make. In my view, nothing in the Baroque was really repeated exactly, but that's my own personal approach with that. But sure. Okay, so here you are, and your first thought is what drives the piece? What moves the piece forward? If you had a view of the composer as a builder, how's the composer build the piece? And in this case, he builds it with variety.
Yes.
Would you say? Yeah. And a kind of a balance between variety and exact repetition.
Right.
That the first half has this arching kind of arpeggio that goes up and then basically comes down and ends up on a dominant chord. And so it's a question. And then the question is exactly repeated, and then the answer is repeated too. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, the concept of surface rhythm is something that I think is important here. That what Handel does is that he varies the surface rhythm in a really interesting way. He doesn't really have any two bars that are the same. And that's especially interesting because in the next movement, we're going to talk about the fifth movement, that's always the same. Fragmented. Bump, bump, bump-a-da-dum.
Yes.
And goes on. And so that rhythm is really pretty consistent throughout that whole beginning of the piece. In this, the rhythm just changes.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess the question is now, what do you need to do technique-wise or musical technique as well to make this piece work?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is, with playing arpeggios, requires more finger control, making sure that you are practicing very clean separation between the notes and clean coordination, and also particularly in the dotted rhythms, that come in measure 5 and further, where you have to make sure that you have very good finger-tongue coordination.
Would you mind showing me?
Sure. You know, yeah, so.
But play the beginning and show me how that's contrasted. Right. So that's really an arc.
Right.
And so you're not only worrying about breath control at the beginning, but you're really worried about how you're kind of cleanly getting from step to step.
Very cleanly going from step to step, correct.
And then, do you have an articulation syllable that you use for dun ka dun ka dun?
It's ta 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 ta. The articulation is more. What I'm trying to do is tie that 30-second note ta-da, 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 to the next note. Yeah, in order to take, and then also helps keep the motion going from the short note to the next note. So.
Okay. So it sounds like you have a pretty good idea of what you'd like to do with this movement. As it goes on, what changes in this movement?
Well, I think when we get later on in the movement, around measure 8 or so, we start having a less dotted rhythm, so it's less of a sharp rhythmic, and that's something where I try to broaden it out a little bit, making the sound a little bit warmer and a bit more connected playing.
So it kind of goes from the beginning, which has that arc and that sense of legato, and then you have the dots which contrast, and then the third part it continues with that first idea a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Does it ever go back to the dotted part?
It does in places. So you have this, and later on in the movement, it's going back and forth between the two different ideas. And I think that you have so it's kind of like a recurring type of motif between the dotted and
okay, so it's a kind of alternation. Yeah, and so it sounds like his musical lunch, what he's making his music out of, is contrast, and something that's melodic and really varies the surface rhythm in a particular way, that he has a smooth and not particularly dotted thing, which is contrasted with little dotted patches.
Yes.
And, well, that sounds like a good decision on what to do, with this particular piece. And let's talk about the next movement.
Okay.
Okay, now we're taking a look at movement 5, and in this, as I was saying before, you've got, a melodic / rhythmic nugget.
Yes.
How about that? Yes. And the nugget is, would you mind playing our nugget for us? Stop. That's our nugget.
Yes.
And what he does is he takes that and he varies it. Now, what does he do to it?
Well, he varies it by actually changing in a very, very subtle way some of the pickups into the dot dot. I mean, the two notes at the end are basically repeated throughout. But he changes what's effectively a trill and the form, kind of the lead in to the next measure. He changes that
Well, yeah, da 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 is basically a trill figure, isn't
it's
it?
a trill figure, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
So and but instead of doing the same figuration every single time that he's in the motif, he changes the way that trill is played.
Oh yeah, how so?
Well, it really has to do with let's say the difference between the opening measure and then measure 9.
Oh, right, which is written differently.
It's written differently.
Yeah. Boy, so what are your options on this?
Well, the options, for instance, are what do you do from an articulation standpoint? Where some of the things to consider on the, let's say, the 32nd note pickups is whether they're articulated or slurred.
Right, because I noticed in the version that I had, which was a handwritten version, though we're not sure it's the urtext.
Right.
But it's wildly different.
Right.
But there are trills in some places, not in others. And I noticed this particular edition, which is called urtext, wasn't that urtext? Because,
well,
yeah,
I don't know, because I looked at the Fitzwilliam
Yeah.
manuscript, which is supposed to be a copy that Handel had wrote. It's not the copy that was the original one that he was working from and was published from, but the urtext does follow that particular
does it?
manuscript.
Well, so it followed something, and I kind of like the idea that there's no one way to do it, that there's a certain variety between these different manuscripts.
Right.
Yeah, which tells us that there's going to be a kind of variety in how we play it too.
Right. And I think one of the things that I guess when I first approached this back years ago was, Handel just left out certain notes and trying to play everything exactly the same rather than varying it, where it's very clear that he that he does make a distinction of different ways of playing that figure.
There's a lot of ways to talk about that. One of the things I like about this particular movement is the second section, because the second section is in the relative minor, and it doesn't have any dots.
That's right.
One thing it carries on, I believe, is the rhythmic thing of bum bum, the next thing bum bum. So because the second section is bottom bum bottom bum, so he takes that half step.
Yes.
And continues with it, and in the development section.
Yes.
And this is one of those things that viol players really agonize over, because the viol has continuous 16th notes. And so in a way, the recorder is accompanying the viol.
Yes. In fact, that's the thing that I find in this piece, in this particular movement. It's like the recorder is basically almost accompanying or providing a commentary or whatever.
Yeah.
A little acting up a little bit on top of the viol line, which is a very which moves quite a bit.
I like that very much.
Yes.
Yeah. One thing that two aspects of how a piece is put together are, in addition, useful here. One is the idea of rhetoric. That I like to think of some pieces as speeches, and some pieces as discussions,
Right.
and some pieces as, poems. And what would you call the first movement?
Well, the first movement is definitely, my concept for it is that it's actually kind of a brisk morning walk, I would say.
Okay.
You're waking up in the morning, you have that soaring figure of the arpeggio. That's kind of like, hey, I'm getting up out of bed, I'm waking up. And then you have that dotted rhythm. It's kind of like, hey, I'm starting to go off for a nice little walk. And then you take a little bit of a pause and maybe think about, well, gee, what happened yesterday or something like that.
So it's a kind of an ongoing scene. It's an ongoing narration.
Right.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And this last movement, though, it's a little different.
Yes, it is. It's. I guess I haven't really really thought about it terribly much rhetorically.
Uh-huh.
I'm not quite sure whether it's dance-like, but it's that.
I don't know. Let's see. All I can think of is bump bum, and I'm thinking meltdown. I mean, I'm thinking kind of a word that's a kind of a gesture. Dumpa, dapa dumpa, da 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 dumpa, bumpa, bumpa. So bubkas, is a good word for that, which means nothing for those of you who don't know Yiddish. Da 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 dumpa. And I call that a gesture, and to me that's kind of the essence of the last movement, that it's playing with that gesture.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a game than some type of rhetorical thing. I think maybe it's a movement game.
Okay.
Than a dance. Yeah. So there's that. And one thing we haven't really talked about at all, but Kurt certainly could, is what the harmony plays in here. What position the harmony plays. Of course, it's important. And when the harmony makes itself known in a B section, when you're suddenly in the relative minor, that implies that you do something different musically too. It warrants a response,
mm-hmm.
especially with Handel, who's very clear in his travels from key to key. So that's something to factor into it as well. So with this discussion, I guess what I wanted to just give a kind of preliminary demonstration of the type of analysis. People know a lot about theory. Some people have had a lot of theory, some people haven't had any, but this is kind of different from theory. What it is really finding out what's going on in the piece in a kind of descriptive way rather than an analytical way, would you
mm-hmm.
say? So we're trying to see what it is that really comes out so that when you try to figure out how you want to play it, it's pretty clear. We were talking about what do you do when you first see a new piece of music, and how much do you use your brain and how much do you use your ears? And what were you saying?
Well, I mean, initially I use my ears. I mean, that's always been the tendency. Play through it, see how it feels, and then try to work my way around how to approach the piece based on that. And of course it means that end up spending an awful lot of time trying out different things and mm-hmm. seeing how it works, because you're not
fun.
Really sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe it's maybe that it ends up taking much more time to come up with an approach, and whether or not whether the approach fits is another matter.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if after the initial listening and kind of getting to know the piece, it might be useful to look at it this way, and that might give you a little bit more information as you develop your own approach to it.
Right. Yeah, I would agree.
Who knows? So thank you very much for coming today, David.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you, Tina.
And thank you for listening.